So let's talk about objects in JavaScript. Now, objects in JavaScript are a crucial part of the JavaScript language, and once we understand objects, we understand JavaScript because almost everything is an object. Now, an object is used to store what we call a keyed collection, and it could be any kind of data from a string to a number, or even storing further objects where we have something called a nested object. Now, the idea of an object is that it is an unordered collection where we use these key and value pairs to go ahead and access the data that we want. Now, you can imagine an object as some kind of storage container that we can put things inside. We can remove items, we can change the items, or we can remove all of the items altogether. Now, in this video, we're going to look at the ways that we can create an object, much like we did with numbers and strings and everything else that we've covered so far. So what we're going to say is a constant, and we'll just call this our drink. Now, we should be very familiar with this approach. We create a constant, and then we assign it the value. Now, to create an object, we create something called an object literal. So this is the first way that we can define an object, and this is the most recommended way that we should define objects. There's not really any point, as we've seen with numbers and strings, to use things such as new number or new string, but they exist in the language nonetheless. So let's go ahead and create this curly brace. So now we have created our new object. So what we can say is console log drink, and we can log it out in the console. Now, if we expand this, we'll see that the prototype is in fact of an object, and it inherits all of these methods which also exist on this global object. So thinking about a drink, now think about a drink that you like, perhaps your favorite drink. Now, a drink, if you went into a bar or a restaurant, to be able to look up the drink in the system, they're probably not going to look up the drink by the name. It's probably going to have some hidden ID. So for this demonstration, we'll create a random ID just to signify that we have some kind of dynamic property, because in a real world application, we save items like a list of drinks in a database. So a database would in fact present us with an ID. And it's typically something which is hashed and doesn't mean anything to our eyes. Now, the next property on our drink, you can put anything you like. I'm going to choose lemonade. And finally, we're going to have the price of the drink, and we're going to say that's 99 cents. So if we go ahead and console log this out, we can now see our object has been printed out in the console. Now, we've learned that an object is some kind of storage container, and it is unordered. So it doesn't matter the order in which we create these properties. We can save this, and yes, they will appear differently, but the way that we can access them doesn't differ. So far, most of the things that we've covered are in fact what we call a primitive value. We've looked at strings, we've looked at numbers, and we also looked at immutability and how a number or a string is completely immutable by design. So what we did was something like this, and we created a reference and pointed it to an existing item, such as what we created above. So we'll do this here as well, because I want to demonstrate to you the difference between the primitive values and the object values. So if we go ahead and say drink reference, we can say .name, and we'll change this one over to peach. Now, if you flick your attention across to our developer console, you can see this name has been updated to peach. Now, we haven't actually changed the object itself because we've deliberately called it a reference. So what happens is this is stored in the memory of JavaScript of our application, and the object is in fact passed by reference. Now let's assume that our console log was perhaps something more complex, and we're trying to access what we think is perhaps this value where we have lemonade, but somewhere else we have something pointing to it which is updating that name, and that in fact updates the whole object. Now, if we were to duplicate our console log and add this above here, we would see lemonade because it hasn't been called, it hasn't been overwritten at that point in time. So that's kind of how an object works. Arrays, when we come onto these, are very similar in how they work as well. But it's good to know that objects are passed by reference. So if we change any of the references, it's going to go all the way back to the beginning and change the initial object reference. Now, what we can also do is look at whether our drink also equals our drink reference. Now, in JavaScript, two objects are never the same, unless they are in fact the same object. So if we hit save here, we'll see the word true. Now that means that the reference is 100% pointing to this, because, for example, if we were to replace this with two different empty objects, to our eyes they look exactly the same, but two objects are never the same, unless they are, of course, the same object, which we've just learned. So moving forward, we also want to explore the different ways that we can create objects. We also have the new object with a capital O. We can save this, and you can see over here we have an object literal returned to us. We also have the just object on its own, which in this case does exactly the same as new object. So there's not really any difference between the two, apart from the fact that we're using the new keyword. What's also interesting, if we attempt to use instance of and call object, when we hit both of these, they'll both be true. Now, object on its own, in fact, calls new object internally. Now, when we looked at things such as number, and we'll change these over to number now, you can see that this number call is not an instance of number. So there's a slight difference here in the language when it comes to dealing with objects. So what we've done in this video is a quick introduction to what an object is. What we have is known as a key with a value, key and a value, and the value could be absolutely anything we want. We could have some further objects. We might have some kind of sale price of 99, and we might have a full price of perhaps 129. So you can see how we can create more complex data structures quite simply with object literals. We also learned about passing objects by reference, how two objects are never the same unless they're pointing to the same object, and the differences, or rather the similarities, between new object and object on its own, using our instance of to see if they are in fact instances of the object. Now, while we're here for completeness, let's also have a look at our object literal to see how that behaves as well. And you may not have guessed this, because this is also something interesting with objects in JavaScript. We also have object literals returning true as being an instance of an object. So that's it for this video. What we'll do is add all three of these back in the source code, so we got some nice reference to go away with.